All right, let's dive into the story of a language that hundreds of millions of people speak all over the world. It's a language with this incredibly rich, vibrant literary tradition, and this is the wild part, its origins are wrapped in a whole lot of mystery.
And just to put that into perspective, Bengali is the sixth most spoken language on the entire planet. Yeah, that puts it right up there with the heavyweights like Mandarin, English, and Spanish.
But here's the puzzle that's at the heart of our story today. For a language this huge, its written form shows up super late to the party. For centuries, right where you'd expect to find a distinct Bengali voice, there's just silence. So where on earth did it come from? To even begin to crack this mystery, we've got to rewind. We have to look at what was going on before Bengali. What were people actually writing and speaking in that part of the world? Well, for centuries, the whole region was a linguistic battlefield. For the longest time, Sanskrit was the undisputed king. It was the language of literature, religion, the courts. Basically, it was the language of power. Then, with the rise of Buddhism, languages like Pali and Prakrit, which were closer to what people actually spoke, started to pop up. But then, the Sena dynasty came along and brought classical Sanskrit right back to the forefront. And this is what's so telling. When we hunt for the oldest pieces of writing we can find in Bengal, we don't find Bengali, not even close. We find Pali. Then we find a swing back to super formal classical Sanskrit. The last great poet of this whole era, Jadav, wrote his masterpiece, the Gita Govinda, in Sanskrit. And that was in the 12th century. The language of the people just wasn't the language of literature. Not yet. Okay, so now let's get to our first real clue that a new language was starting to bubble up from beneath the surface. And believe me, it's a fascinating one. These are the Charyapadas. They were found tucked away in a manuscript in Nepal, and they're a set of 47 mystical songs from around the 12th century. But what's so important is the language. It's this curious cocktail, partly an older language called Apabhramsa, but mixed in are the earliest traces of what we now recognize as Old Bengali dialects. This is it. This is our first real piece of evidence. But here's where the plot thickens. The Charyapadas don't really solve the mystery. They actually make it deeper. They just appear fully formed in what's described as isolated splendor. There's no buildup, no earlier versions, no breadcrumb trail leading to them. They're a beginning with no clear before. So after that one tantalizing clue, the trail goes completely cold. And that leads us to the most dramatic twist in this entire story, a long period of absolute silence, followed by, well, a cultural big bang. I mean it. For 200 years after the Charyapadas, from the 12th century all the way to the 14th, there is basically nothing. No evidence of anyone writing anything in Bengali. It's a total blackout. It's like the language just vanished off the face of the earth. And then, bam, seemingly out of nowhere, everything changes. The darkness just breaks, and suddenly you get what one historian calls this splendor of bright sunshine at noon. It was an incredible, explosive burst of literary creativity. And we're not talking about one or two writers here. Suddenly, it's a whole galaxy of brilliant poets. Names like Chandidas, Krittivas, and Maladhar Basu just emerge from the silence. And they're not just writing little poems. They are literally creating the foundations of an entire literary tradition from scratch. Now, you might think this was all just chaotic creative energy. But it wasn't. This explosion channeled itself into 4 very distinct, very powerful literary streams that would end up defining Bengali literature for hundreds of years. So what were these streams? Well, you have these beautiful Vaishnava lyrics all about the love between Radha and Krishna. Then you have these amazing popular retellings of the great epics. You also get these narrative poems about Krishna's life. And finally, you get the Mangalkavyas, which were poems celebrating popular local deities. An entire literary universe just born in a flash. Let's just take the epic retellings for a second. A poet like Krittivas didn't just translate the Ramayana, he remixed it. He wove in local stories and gave it what's described as the softness of Bengal. And Kashiram Das's version of the Mahabharata became so beloved, it was like a national epic for Bengalis, read and cherished by both Hindus and Muslims for generations. They were taking these ancient stories and making them their own. And this is so important. This new literature wasn't some highbrow academic thing locked away for scholars. No, it was deeply connected to the oral stories and the folktales of everyday people. And this folk tradition was just incredibly rich. These tales started off being passed down from person to person. They often had these amazing, powerful female characters. They showed a society that was changing, moving from just farming to international trade. They even depicted Bengalis as adventurous seafarers. And crucially, these stories became a shared heritage, something that was popular across all religious lines.
And so, by the 15th century, the mystery is pretty much solved. Out of these long centuries of silence and then a sudden, brilliant flash of creative genius, a standard literary Bengali language was finally born. It was a language ready and able to tell its own stories in its own unique voice. So the story of Bengali is just incredible. It's a story of silence, a sudden appearance, and then this explosive growth. And it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many forgotten histories, silent centuries, and brilliant bursts of creativity are hiding in the past of the language that you speak every single day?
The Muslim poets who were absolutely crucial in shaping the Bengali language as we know it. So let's peel back those layers of history and discover some voices that are, too often unheard.
So if I ask you, what's the true root of Bengali literature? What's the first thing that pops into your head? For most people, it's Sanskrit, right? But what if I told you that's not the whole story, not even close? What if the common answer overlooks a massive, transformative influence that forever changed its DNA?
Yeah, because the real story is, well, it's a lot more complex and frankly so much more fascinating. It's this incredible tale of cultural fusion, of how a language evolves, and it's about these creative pioneers who dared to write in the language people actually spoke, not just the formal language of the court.
Okay, so to really get this, we have to go back in time. The literary scene in Bengal was completely dominated by Sanskrit. For centuries, if you wanted to write anything important, religion, philosophy, high art, you used Sanskrit. The local language, the vernacular that people spoke on the streets, it was kind of looked down upon, considered unrefined and not really for serious work.
But then, history turned a page. New rulers arrived, and they didn't just bring a new government. They brought a new court language. And that single change kicked off this incredible chain reaction, a linguistic evolution that would eventually give birth to the Bengali we recognize today. So now you've got this really interesting cultural tension going on. On one side, you've got the deeply established Sanskrit tradition, the ancient language of scripture and poetry. And on the other, you've got Persian, brought in by Turkish conquerors, which very quickly becomes the language of power, of law, and of the administration.
So how did this new Bengali vernacular get forged? Well, think of it like this. With Persian as the official language in court, a real dynamic interaction starts. Words from Persian and Arabic start to mix and mingle with local expressions in the marketplaces and government offices, just in daily life. And out of this amazing creative melting pot, a new, syncretic form of Bengali is born, one that's no longer purely derived from Sanskrit at all.
So, who were the champions of this new, evolving language? This is where we meet the heroes of our story. We're talking about the pioneering Muslim writers who saw its potential, not just as a spoken dialect, but as a way to create profound art. By choosing to write in this accessible language, they were making a powerful choice. They were connecting directly with the masses and building a whole new shared cultural identity.
One of the very first was a man named Sabired Khan, writing way back in the 16th century. He really stands out as one of the earliest trailblazers, someone who saw the literary beauty in the language that people actually used every day. His contribution was just pivotal. By writing a work like Vidya Sundara in this new Bengali, he wasn't just writing a poem, he was making a powerful statement. He was helping to legitimize this emerging language, proving it was just as capable of beauty and complexity as classical Sanskrit.
But of course, the movement didn't stop with just one pioneer. Next, we meet an absolute giant, Syed Sultan. As Sabir Khan lit the spark, Syed Sultan was a prolific force of nature, known for the incredible breadth and diversity of his writing.
The sheer range of his work is just astonishing. He wrote Apabhramsa, this massive work on Islamic prophets, and Sabi Miraj, focusing on the Prophet Muhammad's life. But then, and this is amazing, he also explored the principles of yoga in a work called Jnana Pradeep. This just shows an incredible intellectual curiosity, a mind that was actively building bridges between different philosophical worlds, all within this new Bengali vernacular.
And this spirit of literary innovation got passed down. Muhammad Khan, who was a disciple of Syed Sultan, also made his own huge contributions, and he pushed the boundaries of storytelling even further.
Get this. In his work Satya Kali Vivada Savada, He stages an imaginary quarrel between the age of truth and the age of darkness. I mean, this wasn't just a religious text, this was vibrant creative fiction. He captured the mythological and philosophical anxieties of the time by turning these huge abstract concepts into a living, breathing drama for his audience. Now, beyond their own original works, these poets also acted as these crucial cultural bridges. They took epic romances from Persian and Hindi traditions and just skillfully wove them right into the fabric of Bengali literature, introducing these timeless stories to a whole new audience.
The journey of Layla Majnu is a perfect example. It starts as a famous Persian epic, a cornerstone of that culture's romantic tradition. Then, a poet named Bahram Khan comes along and he translates and adapts it, not just word for word, but he adapts it culturally for a Bengali audience. And just like that, a new classic is born. The tale becomes a beloved romance for generations of Bengali speakers.
And this was a huge trend. It was really enriching the literary landscape. The romance of Yusuf and Juleka was popularized by Shah Muhammad Sagir. Hindu romances like Megravati and the story of Manohar and Madhu Malati also found a new home in Bengali. In essence, these writers were curating a world of stories, building this incredible library of human emotion for their readers.
So what does all of this add up to? Well, the impact of these writers was profound, and it was lasting. They were doing so much more than just writing poems and translating stories. They were actively crafting a new literary identity for an entire culture. So here's the big takeaway. These Muslim architects of Bengali literature played a leading role in pulling the language out from under the total domination of Sanskrit. They forged a unique and dynamic identity for it, one that was rich, mixed, and drew strength from both its ancient Indic roots and its new Persian and Arabic influences. They created a language that truly reflected the world they lived in. And this all leaves us with a final thought. Knowing this history of synthesis and fusion, where a cultural identity wasn't built from a single pure source, but from a creative blend of many, how does that change our view of culture and identity in the world today? Imagine it's the 18th century in Bengal. Do you think a devout Muslim poet could write poetry celebrating the love of the Hindu deities Radha and Krishna? I mean, it sounds pretty unlikely, doesn't it? It just doesn't fit into the neat little historical boxes we're used to.
Well, it turns out the history of Bengali literature has a pretty surprising answer for us, and that's exactly what we're going to unpack right now. So the answer? It's a huge yes. Not only was it possible, it was actually happening all the time. Muslim poets were actively taking part in what we'd think of as traditionally Hindu literary styles. You had poets like Sayyid Murtaza, for example, who became amazing composers of Padabalis. These are devotional poems all about Radha and Krishna. This wasn't some one-off thing. It was a real, living literary exchange.
Now, you might be wondering, where did all this come from? This kind of literary fusion doesn't just pop up out of thin air. It actually had really deep roots in the day-to-day spiritual world of ordinary people. It was built from the ground up. At the very heart of this shared culture was a folk tradition called Panchawali. Think of these as popular ballads, songs that praise local gods and saints. And the crucial part is, they were written and loved by both Hindus and Muslims. This was the common ground, the space where stories and beliefs could really mix and mingle. And get this table really shows you just how deep that common ground went. I mean, look at this shared list of saints and deities. The Hindu deity Sayyid Narayana had a direct counterpart in the Muslim saint, or pir, Satyapir. Bana Durga was worshipped as Bana Bibi. Even the god of crocodiles, Kalu Roy, was revered as Kalu Shah. These weren't two separate worlds operating in a vacuum. They were basically mirroring each other.
But here's where it gets really interesting. While Satyanarayana was a figure worshipped only by Hindus, Satyapir became someone revered by both communities. He was literally the bridge, a perfect symbol of this shared spiritual space, where the exact same divine figure could be honored through two totally different cultural lenses.
Okay, so with that foundation of shared folk beliefs firmly in place, let's circle back to the world of literature and see how this culture of mixing really took off in more formal poetry. We mentioned that term Padabali earlier, and it's super important to understand what it is. This isn't just any old poetry. It's a very specific, deeply religious Hindu genre from the Vaishnava tradition, and it's all about the divine love between Radha and Krishna. So for a Muslim poet to compose in this particular genre, well, that's a truly significant act of crossing cultural and devotional lines.
And we're not talking about just copying stuff here. No way. These Muslim poets wrote their own original Padabalis. They even wrote poems praising the famous Hindu saints Chaitanya. And the cool part is, this was a two-way street. You had writers like Hayat Mahmud who would take the grand, epic style of Hindu texts like the Mahabharata and use that framework to tell Islamic stories. It was a genuine, dynamic, creative conversation.
Now, this whole tradition of literary fusion, it reached its absolute peak in a very specific place and time. And funnily enough, it wasn't in Bengal itself, but in the neighboring kingdom of Arakan.
So, let's go back to the 17th century. The royal court of Roseng, which was the capital of Arakan, became this incredible, vibrant hub for Bengali literature. It was here, with the support and money from the Arakanese king's ministers, that Bengali Muslim poets found the freedom to create some of the most important works of that entire era.
And two names really stand out from this amazing period. First, there was Dalit Kazi. He started writing a famous poem called Sati Maina Mari, but tragically he died before he could finish it. And that's where our second great poet comes in, a man named Alaol, who would not only complete Kazi's work, but would go on to become a literary legend himself.
Alaol's own life story is just as epic as his poetry. I mean, listen to this. He was born in Bengal, and one day, while on a boat with his father, they were attacked by Portuguese pirates. Alaol actually saw his father killed in the raid, but he managed to escape, literally swimming for his life to the Arakan coast. From that absolutely traumatic start, he ended up joining the cavalry, and because of his sheer talent, climbed the ranks to become the most famous poet in the entire kingdom. Just an incredible journey.
His masterpiece was a work called Padmavati. Now, while it was technically based on a Sufi poem, Alaol's version was this brilliant new creation that showed off his incredibly deep knowledge of Hindu sacred texts, the Puranas, and classical Sanskrit literature. You can clearly see the influence of Vaishnava poetry all through it. It was really the ultimate fusion of these two great traditions. So, let's step back for a second. What do we make of all this? What does this incredible literary history actually tell us about the past?
Well, it gives us a powerful counter-narrative, a story that's very different from the idea of two completely separate cultures. We see a solid foundation of shared beliefs among everyday people. We see a sophisticated, high-level literary conversation happening. And we see master poets like Alaol who could move fluently between Hindu and Islamic ideas. What it all points to is a past that was far more interconnected and frankly far more interesting than we often imagine.
And honestly, this quote about Alaol's Padmavati just says it all perfectly. The magic was in the mix. The blending of the romantic with spiritual perceptions is what created something new and excellent. The combination of epic love stories with deep spiritual ideas from both Sufi and Vaishnava traditions, that's what gave the work its unique power. And that leaves us with one last thing to think about. In our world today, which so often focuses on what divides us, what can this shared literary history from medieval Bengal teach us about culture, about creativity, and about identity itself? It suggests that maybe, just maybe, the most beautiful art, the most profound ideas, they don't emerge from isolation, but from all those messy, wonderful, fascinating spaces in between.